It was a motorcycle that paid homage to a very special person in American racing innovation. It really spoiled me for what I had experienced in the past. And I think has spoiled me for the future as well. In a very real sense, this particular bike is like all the cool things about all the KTMs that I've owned put together into one incredible motorcycle. But I don't want to be the only one that gets to enjoy looking at that beautiful motorcycle. So my history with motorcycles goes back a long ways. I ended up riding a motorcycle for the very first time when I was probably about 11 years old, and it was absolute love right off the bat. And then I had to have my own. I couldn't be satisfied with just to borrow one or to ride on a friend's motorcycle. I had to have my own, and so I ended up earning money with my paper route. And I saved up enough money and ended up buying a 1964 Honda CT200. I ended up buying it from my uncle and I rode it all over the place. I delivered papers with it. I loved that bike. But that bike soon wasn't enough and I had to have another bike and another bike. And it's ended up starting a lifelong interest in motorcycles, always different, always better, always faster. Now, I wasn't a great rider, but I enjoyed the ride. I enjoyed riding on motorcycles. I taught my kids how to ride. I taught my grandkids how to ride. So one of the things that we did as a family activity growing up is we ended up to be a motorcycling family. My mom rode, my dad rode, my two brothers rode. In fact, aunts, uncles, all sorts of people rode. And it was always a wonderful time. We were kind of in the middle of what people have talked about being kind of this motorcycling revolution that had taken the U.S. by storm in the late 60s and early 70s. And one thing that we would do is we would go on camping trips, or we would go on these riding excursions up in the National Forest. And one particular trip, I think I was a sophomore in high school, my dad and a friend of his invited me to go along for a ride in the Gifford-Pinchot Forest north of Stevenson, Washington. What I didn't know at the time was the friend of my dad's would be bringing along a motorcycle that I knew very little about. It happened to be, I believe it was a 1972 Penton 125 6 days. This was a completely different motorcycle than anything I'd been used to prior to that. And I looked at that bike and I was transfixed by the look of it, by the quality of workmanship, by the different parts of the bike that seemed to set it apart from every other bike I'd seen prior. Well, my dad and my friend made the fatal mistake of asking me if I wanted to ride that motorcycle. I was able to ride that motorcycle and experienced motorcycling in a completely new way than I had prior to that. And so that began my initial interest in Penton motorcycles and in KTM motorcycles. They were different than what I was used to and better than what I was used to. There are several significant figures in what I would consider to be the off-road motorcycling revolution. And one of those significant figures is a gentleman by the name of John Penton. John Penton was a rider himself, but he was more than that. He was a mechanic, he was a machinist, he was an innovator, and he surrounded himself with very capable people. What happened early on was he was looking for a way to build competitive off-road motorcycles. He had ridden the British bikes in the past and had ridden a BMW and actually won on a BMW, if you can imagine that. We think about that today and it just doesn't seem possible. So John Penton brought an innovative streak to this motorcycling revolution. And he was looking for lighter, dependable, faster motorcycles, for one, so that they could win events, but he was also looking for a way to improve the off-roading dynamic in the US as well. And he was determined to make changes. So he had approached KTM about bringing bikes into the US, and what happened was he was able to convince them that this would be a good investment for them and a good business trajectory. Initially, he asked for several of them to be built to his specs in particular. And so he brought those bikes after they were built by KTM. He actually proceeded to race them himself and proceeded to make sure that they were competitive. And KTM began to see what the advantage of that would be for them to get involved in the US market. So along the way, I'd purchased lots of different types of motorcycles, lots of different brands of motorcycles. And I remember one particular day, and I'd always seemed to find myself, even into my adult years, find myself going into motorcycle shops just to look to see what they had. And I remember one particular day I walked into a motorcycle shop in Hillsboro, Oregon. Had to be about 1997, and there were Hondas and there were Kawasaki's, and if I remember right, there were Suzuki's in there, but there was also a row of orange bikes. And in that row of orange bikes was a baby blue KTM 200 LE. And I saw that bike, and I thought, that is a beautiful motorcycle. Now, up till that time, I'd owned another KTM. In 1996, I bought a 250 EXC, and that was a great motorcycle. I enjoyed it very much. But when that blue bike caught my eye, I knew that that motorcycle had to eventually make its way into my garage. Problem is they were more expensive than other 200, 250, 300cc bikes. That this particular bike, because it was a limited edition, commanded a different price, and so it was more expensive. And so I went back again and again and again to this particular shop, and that bike had not sold. Every time I went in, I looked for the blue bike. I'd look for the blue bike, and then I finally figured out a way to make that blue bike mine. So I ended up buying number 28. Now these bikes are serialized from 0 to 133. They were a limited edition. They were serialized. So the one that I purchased, that would have been in late 1997, was number 28. And when I brought that bike home, I was so pleased. I took all kinds of pictures of it. I showed it to friends. It was just an absolute beautiful motorcycle. And then I ended up riding it a fair amount, enjoyed it very much, changed the plastic on it so that I didn't damage the beautiful blue plastic. But I ended up riding a fair amount. We'd come over to Central Oregon and I rode several events on it and just had a great time with the bike. And then, I don't know, it was a few weeks after I bought it, I got this box in the mail. I wasn't expecting it, but I got this box in the mail from KTM, and I opened it up, and inside there was a hat in there, and there were a couple of mugs in there, a beer stein, and some other odds and ends in there. So I understand why KTM charged a little bit more money for this bike, especially when I got that box of cool stuff that came in the mail. Now, as I understand it, KTM built about 150 of these bikes. These were the brainchild, if you will, of a gentleman by the name of Rod Bush, who was essentially the person in charge of KTM North America at the time. And he saw this motorcycle as being a way to make a splash, marketing-wise, to the new 1998 KTM motorcycles that were going to come out, which would have completely new frame, completely new plastics, would have the PDS suspension, would have hydraulic clutch, and those sorts of things. And these particular bikes were issued in homage to what John Penton had done in 30 years ago in bringing the KTM brand to the US market. And so both the 125cc, the limited edition, and the 200cc limited edition would be a way for Rod Bush and KTM to give homage to John Penton and the significance that he had in bringing KTM to the USA, and also in the off-road scene in the United States. So eventually, I had the bike for a number of years and eventually sold the bike. What happened was I was in on a business venture and needed to make some financial decisions. And as much as I loved that number 28 KTM 200 LE Jackpiner, I also realized that probably was going to be one of the sources that I would use for this particular business venture. So I ended up selling it. And then at that point, I wondered if I would ever own another one. The fact of the matter is there aren't that many of them. There were 133, and obviously by that time, many of them are in various states of repair. Some of them never have been restored to their original condition. Some of them are still being ridden today. I still hear from people that are riding them today. And so as a consequence, I never thought that I would own another one. I had just kind of given up on it. That is, until one fateful day, when I'm looking through Craigslist, as I was wont to do. I'm looking through Craigslist, and I happen upon an ad for a KTM 200. I knew by looking at it, I could tell by the Olin shock and the Marzocchi forks, and I could tell it had orange plastic on it. It didn't even have the blue plastic, but I could tell by looking at it that bike was in fact another 200 LE. I had no idea who the owner was. I sent the owner a note and asked him if he had all of the paperwork to make a transaction legal. I asked him if he had the original plastic. He said he had all of the documentation and he had all of the plastic. I couldn't get to the bank fast enough. So I got off work, went to the bank, got the money, and drove to Pendleton, Oregon. I was asked to go was an old railroad warehouse. So I get out of the truck, and out the door comes the owner. So we exchanged small talk. Apparently he was some local hot shoe rider that did well and then had gotten hurt, decided it was time to sell the bike. But he knew what it was and also knew that he wanted to sell it to somebody that was going to take care of it. He didn't want to sell it to just anybody. So I looked over the paperwork, looked at the bag of plastics that he brought out, and all of the plastics was in good shape, and I realized that this would be a wonderful opportunity for him because he no longer wanted the bike or saw the need for it, but it would also be a wonderful opportunity for me. So I loaded the bike up, paid him the money, and we said our goodbyes, and I made my way back home. So I get back home, and I began to dismantle the things that were on the bike that weren't right and began to put it all back together. I ended up putting it back together, put it on a workbench, a bike workbench in my shop, and it just sat there. But there was a niggling question in the back of my mind, and that is what was the history of this bike? Was there any story to tell about this particular bike? I began to make an inquiry to KTM to see if they knew any of the history of this particular bike. Someone who was a great deal of help at KTM told me that they had a very good intel that this was likely the last Jackpiner. This was likely number 133 of those that were assembled for distribution. I got in contact with the original owner. He told me the story. He kept going into the shop and saw that bike, but he couldn't justify the money that KTM was asking at that point, what MSRP was. But anyway, he told me the story of going back and seeing that bike and then eventually buying it. And then it ended up, he rode it, but not very much. It ended up sitting at his place, I think close to 15 years. Then the second owner bought it, took it to his place in Pendleton, and he owned it for about 10 years. I've had this particular motorcycle for several years now, and I get to look at it every time I go up into my study. And I do. I enjoy it. It's a beautiful machine. But I don't want to be the only one that gets to enjoy looking at that beautiful motorcycle, and to also be able to recognize the important part that it has played in KTM history, Penton history, and the off-roading history here in the U.S. And I didn't want to see that history fade. I didn't want to see it go away. And so when I purchased that bike, my goal was to kind of restore it to its former self, its former glory. But in many ways, it was like a resurrection from the dead. It was something that not many people knew about or many people cared about, but I knew enough about it and valued it enough to see what the motorcycle could be and what the future of this particular bike could be. So the next question became what of it? What should I do with it? Because now I've got this bike and I know what it is, and my interest is having other people know what it is, and at least, for lack of a better word, have them maybe have a little bit of interest too in why we have motorcycles that look like they do today, and why do they have what they have today. Well, this particular bike plays a critical role in kind of the bridge that took place between what KTM was and what KTM is today. And so several months ago, I happened to send an email. It just went to a general mailbox at KTM's Moto Hall in Austria. I had no idea who was on the other end of it, but I asked the question, are you ever interested in interesting motorcycles, particularly KTM's? And if so, I may have something you're interested in. And a couple of days went by, and then I heard back from a woman by the name of Nina, who is the curator of the KTM Moto Hall in Austria. And the KTM Moto Hall is a museum of all kinds of KTM memorabilia and race bikes and all kinds of things that have accumulated over the years. And I heard back from her, and she said, we may be interested in that. Let me ask some questions. Tell me what you have. Send me pictures, and let's see what happens. And then I had a voice message one day on my cell phone that was from a gentleman by the name of Robert Pearce. And Robert Pearce is responsible for KTM operations here in the US, and he said, I would like to talk to you about the Jackpiner. And so he said, send me all of the pictures and all of the documentation, all of that. And so I went up into my study and took some videos and what have you and submitted them to him. And I heard back very shortly from Robert, and he said, I think we're interested in the KTM 200 LE. Well, here we are. It's October 25th, 2022. And in fact, if my math is correct, it's about 25 years since the 200 LE landed here in the US from Austria. That 30th anniversary edition, that commemorative to John Penton, is now on its way back to Austria to be a part of a display at KTM's Moto Hall Museum. In just a few moments, Ciaran Naran's going to be here from KTM to pick the bike up and for it to begin its journey back across the water to the KTM Moto Hall in Manninghofen, Austria. Looking forward to seeing it back home in Austria.
Time for another. Peace.